Intuitive eating could be seen as a logical next pathway out of a long-term dieting period, okay? And that's the way I would like to describe it in this podcast, is that, it is a way of living, absolutely, for some people, but most of the time it will be a pathway out of dieting, not necessarily something that majority of the population are going to be able to go straight into after, not having tracked macros or not having been on a meal plan of some. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah here. Let's discuss the concept and process of intuitive eating. Now, I have done podcasts in the past where I discussed the difference between meal plans, macros, and flexible dieting. I did also discuss how to eat off plan, okay, so for social occasions, etc. But this is going to focus mostly on how to eat intuitively long term. So it's not just for a temporary couple of days, but how you can actually eat intuitively and maintain your results long term. Firstly, I will attempt to define what intuitive eating actually is, plus what some of the benefits of engaging in intuitive eating might look like and what some of the downsides might be, as well as how you can learn to eat intuitively, tuning into your body's needs whilst considering your macronutrient and micronutrient requirements. I would strongly recommend listening to this podcast if you are looking at breaking free from constantly dieting, tracking your macros, or even following a meal plan. And it seems counterintuitive for me to give this advice, given that as a coach, the way that I make my living is teaching people how to track macros. But I also actually really believe in eventually moving on to intuitive eating as a way of living. And certainly for those who don't have a major goal for fat loss or large amounts of muscle gain, intuitive eating may be perfect for you. If you're just looking at improving your nutrition, your relationship with food, and shifting away from a dieting mindset, it definitely could be something that you could adopt. So what is intuitive eating? You won't find many coaches who will engage in the process of teaching a client to eat intuitively. Perhaps for a temporary amount of time, but not always successfully as a lifestyle. Generally, this is because most of the time when a client learns how to eat intuitively, that then they're then able to sustain their nutritional choices independently of their coach. So it can be a little bit of a fear factor for coaches that they might lose a client upon learning how to maintain their results and eat, the foods that they enjoy and not actually need a coach anymore. However, one of my major goals as a coach is to actually educate my clients heavily enough with tracking their macros, plus implementing flexible meals and days outside of competition prep, cut down phases obviously, because we need to be very accurate with those, so that eventually once they have reached their major goals, they will be able to eat intuitively and sustain a healthy and balanced lifestyle. Intuitive eating is often a hot topic discussed in the health and fitness industry, but it can in fact be fairly difficult to master long term. Intuitive eating can be defined as the process of listening to your body and its hunger cues and fullness cues, without implementing any sort of purposeful dietary restriction, such as counting calories, macros, following a meal plan, or following a fad diet. I'll describe some of the downsides to dieting long term before diving into how to eat intuitively and where this may be applicable and appropriate for you and your lifestyle and goals. Obviously, calorie counting, along with tracking your macros, does come with its known benefits. The accuracy of knowing that you are eating in a calorie deficit to ensure fat loss, or a surplus to ensure muscle gain, or at maintenance to maintain and achieve a little bit of both slowly over time, only if you are fully adherent. The ability to hit your macronutrient requirements, which will be designed specifically to match up with your goals, and the ability to adhere to an accurate numerical measurement of your food intake, or at least as accurate as possible. Okay, so these are the benefits of tracking. The downside to tracking macros long-term is that a person can become rather obsessed by numbers and tracking itself, and also limit themselves from enjoying family events or social occasions in fear of straying from their calorie goal. Another downside can include the fact that a person might not actually ever come out of a calorie deficit by choice. And this is where we can see a high risk of metabolic adaptation, muscle wastage, risks posed for their health, and potentially establishing disordered eating behaviors or eating disorders themselves at worst, and a poor relationship with food. The downside of following a meal plan long-term is very simple and obvious. It can be very restrictive, incredibly restrictive, without any sort of long-term education. A lack of food variety, potentially developing a negative relationship towards food and micronutrient deficiencies over time, okay? Similar to tracking macros and calories, it can also isolate a client and put them into a position where they fear attending social events, eating off plan, and they sustain very little education coming off a meal plan to be able to maintain the physical results, usually given that they go back to the way they were eating prior to following the meal plan. Fad diets, okay, could be considered, and in fact I would consider them the worst way to diet in that they are not necessary nor required to reach a health and fitness goal at all. So the first two there, the calorie tracking and the meal plan, they're logical. We often use them in nutrition practice. This third one is one that I wouldn't even use at all. But it is something that finds its way into people's lives, and unfortunately this is where a lot of people can, never find their way with intuitive eating after this. Cutting out entire food groups and following strange restrictive rules with food, which most of the time will just involve a roundabout way of eating in a calorie deficit anyway. So if you think about it, if you cut out a particular food group, in some way, if you're cutting that out of your diet daily, you're just putting yourself into an energy deficit somehow. But you don't actually need to cut that food group out at all. It's actually just about the amount of energy in the foods. And I've talked about this in other podcasts. That's the most important factor in your fat loss goals and for your muscle gain goals as well if you're wanting to go upwards in weight. Unfortunately, again, we see with fad diets, clients are establishing, or even just people in general, are establishing a poor relationship with food, misconception and lack of solid evidence-backed education on nutrition choices, and completely misleading information with regards to what's actually required in their diet, as well as potential macronutrient deficiencies and issues with energy level production, muscle wastage, and impacted health and blood markers. You'll also see some of these crossover into meal plans and tracking, so impact on energy levels as well, which is partially going to have a lot to do with metabolic adaptation. But you can see how they kind of intertwine with one another. And I talked about why in another podcast why chronic dieting isn't working for you. But I just wanted to describe, the major methods that are used for dieting and why long-term they're not going to be of benefit for anybody in particular. And that's my professional belief, and it's certainly how we've been educated as nutritionists, is that we should be going through periods of time where we are intuitively eating. Sadly, obviously the last style of eating with the fad diets can often be the popular choice for those who seem to struggle with fat loss or even maintaining their results after the dieting period has ended. Due to the cultural appeal, with the perceived no-fuss convenience and the gimmicks often associated with fad diets. So interestingly enough, I find that the reason why people want to jump on the bandwagon with fad diets is because they're interesting. They're entertaining. It's like this new, flashy, amazing thing. And we've been studying nutrition since the 1930s, at least deeply, sports nutrition itself. But certainly dietetics goes back hundreds of years. But on a scientific level, we've been studying nutrition since the 1930s. And what we've discovered is that, since then, we haven't discovered a lot more than what we discovered in the beginning, right? And it is that energy balance is going to be one of the major key components in allowing an individual to lose fat loss. In fact, it will be, along with obviously their factors that are involved with their own metabolic responses, such as their resting metabolic rate, their age, I've talked about this before, their sex, etc., which will impact how much energy they burn every day. So now I've covered that topic because I always have to. Some of these people have only, like my listeners, have only listened to my podcast. Maybe this might be the first episode. So it's just very important that I have to repeat myself in some instances to define what dieting really looks like in the lead up to potentially being able to go into intuitive eating. So why should we and when should we eat intuitively? Intuitive eating could be seen as a logical next pathway out of a long-term dieting period, okay? And that's the way I would like to describe it in this podcast, is that, it is a way of living, absolutely, for some people, but most of the time it will be a pathway out of dieting, not necessarily something that majority of the population are going to be able to go straight into after not having tracked macros or not having been on a meal plan of some sort, unless they've been able to maintain a fairly reasonable composition prior to the intuitive eating period. And that's intuitive eating anyway. Not just on the odd occasion, for this intuitive eating style, not just for special events with flexible meals and days in place and tracking outside of that and on a meal plan outside of that, but simply implementing intuitive eating as a lifestyle choice that you can sustain well into the future. And in fact, you can even go through prolonged periods of intuitive eating, such as months and years, broken up with smaller periods of tracked dieting for fat loss or tracked eating in a surplus for growth. A few circumstances where intuitive eating may be applicable and recommended, whereby you have no immediate fat loss goals, or at least no drastic fat loss goals within a set time frame. You have no major muscle growth goals and you're happy with your current muscle density and strength. You simply want to maintain your results and enjoy your life without restrictions and constantly tracking numbers. You are on a long holiday overseas. This would also apply if you're playing team sports and you are totally okay with just eating how you feel like eating and your energy levels are pretty good from doing so. You have reversed out of a competition and do not have a goal to grow or even compete for years to come. Perhaps you may benefit from some freedom and flexibility in your diet for, say, 6 months to a year plus before committing to a tracked phase for either a surplus or deficit before competing again. And it could be that you go through 5 to 6 months or a year of a surplus and say, look, what, I need to grow a couple of maybe 1 to 2 kilos of lean mass. How long is that going to take me? How long do I need to be in a purposeful surplus for? And then obviously, how long do I need to deficit for? So then you could look at the timeline and go, well then, all right, that means I've got this much time eating intuitively. I've got this much time to then be able to go into a surplus. And then I've got this much time to then go into a deficit. So that's a conversation you can have with a coach. You are recovering from an eating disorder, and tracking is a major trigger. And this is one that is probably the most important point of all of these, whereby I would highly recommend it. And this is coming from, a nutritionist, where I don't get to work with people with eating disorders, but certainly that if you are working with a psychologist or a dietitian, which you should be recovering from an eating disorder specifically, that they will work with you on eating intuitively and moving away from tracking eventually. And it is a really difficult thing to do because I had to do it myself. I don't recommend doing it alone if you're recovering from an ED. You'd like to get back in tune with your body and enjoy some of the foods you've left out of your diet for quite some time. Not just processed foods, but even some foods like maybe avocado or nuts or seeds that you may have forgotten or neglected because you've gotten comfortable eating the same foods every day, or maybe you've been on a meal plan that didn't have them, in the meal plan. You've been dieting or tracking your macros for literally months or even years on end. And I have heard stories about this where people have literally tracked their macros for 6 to 8 years or been on a meal plan for 6 to 8 years. And it might be that you want to give yourself some time to have a mental break from this to protect your mental health and well-being. You may be injured, recovering from surgery or a chronic illness or disease, and need to focus on micronutrients and food variety rather than macros and calories. So oftentimes, if you're in hospital, if you're in you've just had surgery, you've got 6 to 8 weeks of recovery and there's not a lot that you can do exercise-wise. And even then it's a bit touch and go, and maybe it's impacted your stomach and it's impacted your digestion and your food preferences, all that type of stuff. Sometimes it's just not ideal to be tracking. Sometimes you do need to go through a period where you can intuitively eat for weeks or months on end, just so that you can get through that period of recovery. When you're pregnant or breastfeeding, okay? So I've had clients fall pregnant whilst coaching with me, and honestly, some of them have attempted to track and I would not even recommend it. I don't think that being super conscious of your calories, I think, yes, it's good to have an idea because obviously you don't want to end up with, gestational diabetes or preeclampsia. These are conditions that can definitely be exacerbated by over-consuming certain types of foods, including saturated fats, really high sugar diets with an excess of calories specifically. But so I do recommend especially for pregnant or breastfeeding mothers, and this comes from professional standpoint, that tracking your macros is not going to be something that you can sustain. Certainly not through that first trimester, which I'm going through at the moment with sickness and that type of thing. It's really not something that I would recommend. I myself, I eat intuitively most of the time, and in fact, I'm currently doing so. Obviously, being pregnant, it would be suggested that we should be attempting to eat intuitively as much as possible due to the high demands for nutrients and changing needs of the body to cover all bases of these requirements. Variety is incredibly important in the diet, as well as covering all bases to prevent deficiencies. For both mum and bub, during pregnancy and breastfeeding. I also engaged in large chunks of time eating intuitively when recovering from anorexia for 3 years, after properly reversing out of one of my shows between seasons, and again after reversing properly out of my last season when I prepped myself. I don't generally track between seasons at all, and that's usually as a result of the fact I've spent a long time tracking, so I have that under my belt. I actually intuitively ate literally the day after I finished my last competition, all the way up until engaging in a programmed off-season for 6 months this year. Obviously that changed when I fell pregnant. I had to go back to intuitive eating. I wouldn't necessarily recommend for any competitor, let alone coaches, because I know that even some coaches struggle with this. I've listened to quite a few podcasts where coaches actually say, I would dream of eating intuitively, but I don't trust myself. But I don't recommend it for any others finishing the first day after their comp, because a lot of them won't have that tracking history behind them and also won't have done a lot of the work with being able to eat intuitively, which I did very extensively in my recovery, which was a wonderful tool to be able to use in my own reversals. And obviously that would apply to, unless they've found that they're well established, okay, and well versed with this kind of practice. So if you're someone like me who knows how to track like the back of your hand, and it's something that comes very naturally to you, and intuitively eating is something that you've been able to do in the past and you do trust yourself, it obviously is something that you could engage in. But as I said, I don't recommend it for 99% of competitors the day coming out of their show. Yes, and it's because I have a background knowledge and years of tracking my macros intermittently for 11 years on and off. I know how to estimate and eyeball my protein, my carb, and my fat sources, and understand the calorie content of meals and the different macro and micronutrients required in my diet without having to measure or weigh anything. Specifically, mostly for maintenance periods, when I decided I wanted to grow a significant amount of muscle and go and compete in IFBB as a natural athlete. It was a big goal, obviously, to have, and I had to then justify that by being able to keep a track of and ensure I was eating enough carbohydrates, which is the biggest struggle of eating intuitively, is that you probably won't be eating enough carbohydrates for performance specifically. You probably could, hit your protein and your fat intake, but your carbs will be the biggest struggle point. The benefits of intuitive eating can be seen in the processes of repairing our relationship with food, learning to understand our hunger cues and fullness cues, having the freedom, confidence, and ability to attend social events and family occasions, reaching a wider array of food types and essential micronutrients, exploring our palate and food preferences and textures, understanding which foods make us feel different ways, full of energy or maybe sluggish, for example. Understanding portions, eyeballing proteins, fats, and carbs, okay? Making informed decisions at social occasions, enjoying some of the processed foods we eliminated from our diet in moderation. I always use the birthday cake example because it's one that we all kind of get a bit triggered by at events. Eating frequently and repairing our attitude towards food as fuel and nourishment for our bodies. Improving the relationship we have with our body image and being okay with maintaining where we are instead of yo-yoing or chasing more or better constantly. Reducing anxiety, guilt, or triggers around food choices, establishing a deeper connection with our satiety levels, and not feeling the need to finish a meal just because it's there in front of us. Preventing spirals of binge eating or extreme deprivation behaviors, breaking free from dieting and giving yourself permission to live a happy and full life away from crunching food numbers. And many more. There are obviously going to be a multitude of other benefits, but that's just a list of some that I know of. In what circumstances would intuitive eating not be of benefit? So obviously we know what the benefits are, but in which case would we say, look, I don't recommend this for you, and it's probably, let's get real about it. It's probably not going to help you get to where you want to be. So there are going to be circumstances where intuitive eating simply isn't for you, especially in circumstances where you will have specific goals in relation to fat loss and or muscle growth. It's not usually recommended that elite athletes or sporting athletes nearing a pre-season or off-season and on-season or comp prep phase engage in intuitive eating for obvious reasons, especially not long phases. Of course, flexibility is recommended in an off-season or pre-season, to some extent. So it's not like, you're not in the thick of it and you're not trying to diet, or you're not trying to, perform at your absolute best. Yes, obviously with pre-season and off-season, you're going to want to have some sort of plan in play. in place, but you're still going to have some flexibility with events, because we'd be mad to tell you that you couldn't. And if there are coaches who are doing that to you, if you're in the off season, you're not cutting, you're not trying to lose body fat and you're trying to grow muscle, and they do limit you and say, look, I don't want you having any special occasions at all, you need to fire them. Fire your coach if they're telling you to do that. But in most cases, especially for elite team sports and those who are competing at a world-class level, unfortunately, intuitive eating and flexible eating is not always going to be a benefit to their sport-specific goals. This is their career. For a lot of people, even for coaches as well, this is our lifestyle and our careers. So we will have to go through periods of time where we do track our foods, and we do. We can't just eat intuitively when we want to lose body fat. That's not how it works. We're not immune to this. We do. There are exceptions where it is required. This is where a dietitian or sports nutritionist will come into play with mapping out a plan. So this is where our role really takes flight, especially with athletes. Ensuring an athlete's adherence to dietary requirements, numerical measurements of calories, and data or a meal plan respectively. Outside of athletic requirements, if you are just an everyday person, so if you're not an athlete, you're just looking to achieve fairly specific results, so you want to lose a certain amount of body fat, or you want to gain a certain amount of muscle mass, or you just want to look different, if you want to recomp your body, for example, then, intuitive eating is not going to be an appropriate approach for you. We know that. When we have specific goals, it would be deluded of me to tell you that you could intuitively eat and smash all those goals. I did go through a mini cut once myself without tracking, which was fairly successful, but I probably could have done it a little bit more efficiently. And I may not have reached my accurate macronutrient requirements daily, but I did want to trial it and see how I went. But to get a better result, you would have to track. And certainly for someone who isn't a coach and doesn't have years of experience tracking, it would be very difficult to do something like this. There is not enough evidence to support that intuitive eating, can lead to long-term fat loss or significant muscle gain. There is absolutely, however, a better relationship established with food and less instances of obesity with those who engage in intuitive eating long-term, and that's inclusive of understanding what they require from a micronutrient perspective as well. So we're not just talking about people who just eat what they want, but we're talking about listening to your body properly. So listening to hunger cues and also understanding portions and the like. There is especially mindful eating with regards to what their macro nutrient requirements are. So it's not just, and I'll reiterate this, that what I mean by that statement is you will get a better result with intuitive eating, right? It's not just about eating what you want and when you want, and putting the chips away and the soft drink away and, I'll just listen to my body and have KFC every night. The mindful eating in place in conjunction with the micro and macronutrient requirements in mind, and mindful eating being that you take your time with your eating, I'm going to discuss this a little bit later in the podcast, is where you'll see a greater success and prevention of obesity and issues with excessive fat gain. So there's a fine line between eating what you want and eating intuitively. Those two concepts are very different. But this is usually executed more successfully with a period of time, as I said previously, spent tracking or at least understanding calorie or portion control, to have this as an educational foundation for intuitive eating. So even though I'm saying, look, intuitive eating is fantastic, you should give it a go, if you haven't, number one, at least been on a meal plan at some point for a prolonged period of time, or, for decent chunks. If you haven't done the work with learning how to track and understanding what is in your foods, really very basic when it comes to coaching. If you've gone and had a coach and you know how to track your foods, you understand portions, etc., protein, carbs, and fats, then yes, you're going to have a lot more success with eating intuitively, because you're going to have that background knowledge. You're already going to have that foundation built there. Basically, it can be very beneficial to start out with tracking macros or calories for a specific goal, following a meal plan, and then looking at the direction you would like to go in long term with your eating patterns and relationship with food. So having, as I said previously, having a pathway out of that to intuitive eating. Possibly having an exit plan as to when you would like to transition into intuitive eating with your coach, And again, I would only suggest this if you don't have specific goals. And look, most of us are going to have specific goals if you have a goal to maintain, you're probably not going to come to a coach, but sometimes you might. Maybe you're sick of dieting all the time, or going into a surplus to grow, and you think, you know what, I want to learn how to maintain without having to track my macros or follow a meal plan. I have, however, rarely seen clients, or anyone for that matter, successfully eat intuitively and maintain their physical goals without some sort of background education or knowledge of nutrition and calorie intake. However, obviously there are instances of individuals who have perhaps gone their entire lives without tracking their calories or following a meal plan, and have been able to sustain a fairly healthy lifestyle and achieve their physical goals. This is an incredibly rare occurrence, as I said, and something that is incredibly difficult to do. Especially if there has been a prior history of disordered eating patterns or poor relationships with food and food choices. Even so, if there has been a history of under-eating or overeating, avoiding food groups, obesity/high body fat percentage, or a struggle with gaining and maintaining a healthy body fat percentage in general, so on the other end of the spectrum, and muscle mass, so someone who's significantly underweight. I don't like using under and overweight too much because weight for me isn't a big factor when we're building muscle. So either too high or too low with relation to what's healthy for their health markers. The reality of the matter is that intuitive eating is obviously incredibly enticing and alluring for those wanting to enjoy their life, achieve their optimal physical goals and health, and repair their relationship with food and feel mentally at ease. However, usually if an individual has specific goals for their physique and health, or requirements to improve their health markers in relation to their body fat percentage and or muscle growth, they will need to undergo a decent period of allocated time with an accurate calorie and macro breakdown or a meal plan. There is really no other way to engage in this endeavor successfully. So how do we eat intuitively? Like, you've heard about what the benefits are, what the downsides are, what intuitive eating looks like. How do we do it? I'm going to explain this in a podcast. It's very valuable information and something that you're not going to get for free anywhere else. Intuitive eating is a skill which requires plentiful practice and application. It is definitely a trial and error process in which there will be more error before there is a large amount of success. Much like learning any other type of skill, intuitive eating is going to be difficult in the beginning, especially if you have been tracking your calories or macros or following a meal plan for a prolonged period of time. The basics of understanding how to eat intuitively doesn't necessarily just mean listening to your body. Of course, that is a typical line used when describing the process. But if we were to constantly listen to our bodies, as I said earlier, sometimes we would make decisions that aren't actually aligned with what our body really needs, okay? And I can definitely relate to that at the moment with some pregnancy cravings. Because let's be honest, your body doesn't need takeaway food. It doesn't need a kebab, doesn't need KFC, doesn't need ice cream. We can obviously survive without these food items and achieve our micronutrient requirements in other areas of our diet. Intuitive eating involves finding a balance with our food choices, and it's usually it's a combination of making informed decisions for your micronutrient and your macronutrient requirements, and allowing yourself some freedom with portions and measurements, and even incorporating foods that you enjoy that are slightly more processed. So meaning that you don't weigh your food, right? Yes, you might use like cups and spoons and things like that, which will be a little bit better for accuracy, but in essence, you're not working off numbers so strictly and stringently. A great rule of thumb to start with is going to be the 80% whole foods and 20% fun foods concept, which I have touched on a couple of times in other podcasts. Basically, this notion suggests that we should attempt to consume 80% of the foods in our diet coming from whole food sources, such as complex carbohydrates, including whole grains, rye, whole wheat, bread, pasta, so bread/pasta, not bread pasta. Wouldn't bread pasta be delicious? I'm pretty sure bread pasta is just normal wheat pasta. Oats, brown rice, cereals, and starchy veg, including potato and sweet potato. Fun fact, sweet potato is a root vegetable, not a potato. Plus different colored fruits and vegetables and legumes and beans respectively. So that's for carbs. Lean protein sources such as lean cuts of meat, eggs, lean meaning low-fat cuts of meat, eggs, egg whites, and lean dairy in smaller amounts. So dairy is one of those ones where you don't want to have large amounts of dairy because then your calories can add up over time. Healthy fats coming from nuts, seeds, legumes, low-fat dairy again because it crosses over into protein and fats, avocado and eggs. And avocado also has some carbs in it, and eggs also have some protein in it. So that's why we have them in both categories. In fact, you could include avocado as a fruit. A clear indication that you are obviously avocado that you need to be very careful with, because if you have too much of that, again, if you eat a whole avocado, if you look up how many calories are in avocado, it's wild. A clear indication that you're consuming, whole food is going to be in reference to the fact that the food has remained as close as possible to the original ingredient it was intended to be, okay? So think about that. For example, if you think of the list of food items I just mentioned, not many of them are going to include more than a couple of ingredients to manufacture them. Obviously vegetables, it's just a vegetable, it's just one ingredient. And that's the whole idea, whole food, it's a whole food by itself. Bread, cereal and pasta, and some dairy being the major exceptions, okay, to this rule. However, majority of the ingredients in these items should be based off mostly the whole grain and whole food sources. So obviously in dairy, it's dairy, okay? So the basis is that most of your meals are going to be constructed from these major building blocks. And the remaining 20% can absolutely come from more processed foods, including our sometimes foods such as lollies, fatty meats, fatty foods in general, some ice cream, soft drink, chocolate, low-fat crisps, and some high sugar spreads, dips, and sauces, amongst others. Alcohol and mixers are probably the silent killer in this list, as there is no such thing as a beneficial level of alcohol consumption for health especially. There's plenty of study to prove this. There just isn't. It's not good for you no matter how much you have. As these liquid calories can add up quickly, inclusive of other liquid calories, of course, but alcohol is very calorie dense and unfortunately see us tip into a surplus and gain fat rapidly and fairly inconspicuously as well, given that it's usually on top of your food as well. Most people are eating their foods and then they're drinking alcohol on top of that. So that's where it can top up the calories. This doesn't mean that that 20% portion is going to be responsible for any sort of suspicious fat gain. Don't get scared about eating these foods at all. It's just that they must be consumed in moderation, and even so, really small portions as well, because they're so calorie dense. But more so, these sources of foods are going to be a little bit less dense in micronutrient value, okay? So they're not going to have as many of those fun bad boys. Higher in calories for the amount of food we see visually in front of us. So interestingly enough, you look at spinach, for example, it's pretty low in calories for a whole cup of it. But then if you have a whole cup of oil, it's a very different scenario. They may not make us feel as satisfied, so full for as long, especially if it's in relation to sugars and alcohol, because liquid calories and certainly highly processed foods can, not fill us up, even chips, for example. But fattier foods can fill you up for longer, but again, they're going to be very calorie dense. So specifically, if we've got a higher consumption of sugar in the diet, there is a risk of over-consuming total calories for the day. But not necessarily specifically in relation to fat gain and sugar consumption. So don't look at sugar as if it's the thing that causes fat gain. It's a really important thing don't make that correlation. It's just that sugar, okay, in a pure form of sugar and certainly liquid sugar, is much easier to eat in larger amounts accidentally, okay? And therefore overconsume total calories accidentally. Also, overconsumption of saturated fats increases the risk of heart disease and high cholesterol, which should be limited to less than 10% of the total dietary intake daily. Not of your total fat intake daily, your total dietary intake daily. This is why we need to be cautious of consuming foods that have too many added oils or deep fried or even fried foods from takeaway establishments or even packaged high-fat foods. And you can see the fat content on the back. Another incredibly important component of eating intuitively is eating regular and filling meals, mostly following a structure of 3 main meals, including breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and at least 2 to 3 snacks, including morning tea, afternoon tea, and dessert potentially. That old structure that we used to go by works. It still works. As long as those portions are obviously not out of control and we are understanding, and I'll explain this in a bit, how to actually do that. Eating more regularly reduces the risk of uncontrollable hunger, okay, and making poor choices around food when reaching food times. When you are more hungry, you can often be dysregulated when it comes to choosing what's right for you. And we see this commonly with general population. They won't eat much during the day. They might have a coffee for breakfast, a salad for lunch, they might have another coffee for afternoon tea, and all of a sudden they're like, why am I gorging at dinner? Why am I eating so much? It's because you didn't eat enough during the day. And that will then lead to low blood sugar, and voila, you end up making silly choices and sometimes over-consuming all of your calories at night. Focusing on portions for your meals is incredibly important in this process. Ensuring that you follow the government guidelines, yes, okay, for dietary and general practice for dietetics and nutrition. So the dietary guidelines have been designed and certainly improved year upon year upon year upon year, and there's a reason why they exist. It's to help you. A quarter of your plate containing a lean protein source or combinations thereof, so it could be that it's lean meat or a little bit of dairy, lean dairy as well, low fat dairy, sorry. Or in the case of breakfast, it might look like including a scoop of protein powder if you don't like eating meat for breakfast, which most of us don't. Bacon is obviously not preferential for breakfast because it's going to contain quite a lot of saturated fats. So keeping in mind, if you have tracked your meals in the past or followed a meal plan, you're going to have a rough idea of what your protein portion for each meal is going to look like, eyeballed, because you've already prepared this many times before. And if you're maintaining your weight roughly around the same, your protein intake requirements are going to stay fairly similar. So that's the other cool factor of that. A quarter of your plate containing carbohydrates, whole grains or starchy vegetables, and the remaining half containing mostly non-starchy vegetables. So we talked about potato being starchy and sweet potato starchy, and non-starchies being like things like greens, with a small contribution towards your total fat intake on the plate. Okay, so you shouldn't be having a whole avocado. You don't want to be having a quarter of the plate with nuts and seeds or anything like that, because again, you can look at overdoing it. Total vegetable intake for the day, you should look at least 300 grams of non-starchy veg and 500 grams plus. Okay, so this is not for everybody. You can obviously have more, including starchy vegetables such as potato. Okay, so 300 grams of non-starchy at least, and 500 grams in total, including potato, but you can have more. And this is going to, for example, men, they can obviously deal with a little bit more in the way of carbohydrates and even protein if they weigh a bit more. And certainly fats if they're eating more calories. Keeping in mind as well that your plate should be the size of a standard dinner plate, okay? And not as large as possible to cheat the system. We're not having like a cheese platter for your dinner plate. Remaining aware of reducing fattier cuts of meat and deep fried foods, including potato chips, avocado. Yes, you can eat avocado, just don't eat a whole one, okay? Even a half one can sometimes be a bit much. Dairy and sauces or condiments, which may contain additional fats. Nuts, seeds, and even spreads containing nuts or legumes should be used sparingly, because these can often, again, add up the calories quickly as well. So if you are the person putting on, 3 to 4 tablespoons of peanut butter on your sandwich, maybe be mindful of the fact that will actually have more calories in it than the bread itself. As far as snacks are concerned, you can be a little bit more exciting with these, certainly including possibly 2 to 3 serves of fruit daily into your snacks. And I would definitely recommend doing this, because obviously then you're meeting your micronutrient requirements from fruit. Or incorporating a fruit into your breakfast potentially, and definitely making sure that they're different fruits. Don't just have the same fruit over and over again. A serving of fruit is considered anywhere from 100 grams to 150 grams. So this would be considered perhaps a large banana or a large apple or a cup of watermelon, for example. Then also using a guide of a small plate for your morning tea, whether it be coming from a carbohydrate source of some type. Maybe this could be where you incorporate some of those 20% foods, so those fun foods. But even so, this is where you can start to include things like rice crackers, rice cakes, a sandwich, a bowl of cereal, even coming from whole food sources again, which have been conveniently converted to a more snack-like friendly option. And even looking towards maybe a low-fat ice cream or a yogurt snack for dessert. There are obviously fiber requirements to take into consideration to ensure that you are regular in your toiletry habits. And interestingly enough, the minimum requirement for men is slightly higher than women, but we actually find that men are more likely to underconsume their fruits and vegetables, so probably not actually hitting their fiber intake. It's difficult to know if you're reaching a full dietary fiber intake if you're not tracking your food currently, but it is very important to meet your dietary fiber intake so that you are regular, you go to the toilet frequently, you're not bloated. Yes, bloating will usually come from not going to the toilet as frequently or gases in the stomach. But also in general, it actually helps to prevent bowel cancer, okay? Because it actually reduces the absorption of carcinogens that are released from meats as we digest them. However, if you follow most of the guidelines, with your fruit and veggie intake with regards to portions and whole grains and nuts and seeds, and really start to group that together, you should find that reaching a fiber intake naturally will be possible. Liquid calories, including juices, sauces, honey even, and takeaway smoothies, maple syrup included, are something to be mindful of, and I talk about sauces because there are lots of sauces that contain lots of different ingredients, sometimes high in fat, sometimes high in sugar, sometimes high in fat and sugar. Obviously, in moderation, these are going to be completely fine, okay? But if you're consuming liquid calories, even in the way of chocolate milk, for example, in liters daily, you're going to struggle with feeling satiated or full from these foods, as you will probably end up over-consuming your calories because you're not feeling full, right? So you'll just keep eating. If there is an inclusion of too many of them, especially, obviously, in larger amounts, you will definitely be going over your calories. My recommendation is always to attempt to eat your fruit instead of blending it where possible. So, I'm not a big person on juicing or blending. I have been having a little bit of juice in pregnancy to help out with blood sugar, but in essence, I do suggest just eating your fruit. So you've got the fiber, it fills you up for a bit longer and you don't accidentally overconsume a shit ton of calories in one sitting. Despite the recommendations given above for portions and meal frequency, one person's maintenance, so important, I tell you this, so important. One person's maintenance calories is going to be vastly different to another person's, but this is why, and we feed into this next point of talking about how to respond to hunger cues, because that's where that's going to actually help you with that and figuring out how much you should actually be eating. So there are obviously going to be variances in amounts of carbohydrates, fats, and protein required for each person, respectively. Generally, though, if you have tracked your meals at maintenance before, you're going to have a good idea of what this will look like for you. Okay, so you're going to know what your maintenance is if you've already practiced this. This is why I suggest doing it beforehand. Additionally, it's important to listen to your hunger and fullness cues, as mentioned. This can be incredibly difficult to do after tracking your macros or following a meal plan for quite some time, because you've been dictating to your body what you should be eating instead of thinking about it and listening to your body. But it will take plenty of practice and patience. You can certainly incorporate mindful eating into the process of intuitive eating, whereby you take your time chewing your food as much as possible, not rushing through eating your meals, sitting down to eat your meals and waiting for 20 minutes after finishing a meal or snack. Taking some time to digest your food and for satiating signals to reach your brain. Understanding when you're actually hungry, okay, and it's been a couple of hours since you've eaten perhaps, it might be time for you to sit down and consume a meal or snack, so not putting off your eating as well. Having structured and set times for eating, okay, and what we can often find is that we find ourselves, sidetracked, so maybe we might need to set alarms or have specific times that we eat and write it down somewhere in our diary. Usually legitimate hunger will be paired with an obvious hungry feeling in your stomach, a lack of energy, and a lack of ability to concentrate. It's incredibly important that you don't miss meals, and especially at a time when you're fuzzier than usual. So this might be somewhere between, say, lunch and dinner, whereby you're not including a snack, or even breakfast and lunch. You might not be having morning tea. And you might need to actually start to incorporate one in order to see you through to the afternoon or your mid-morning through to lunch, instead of reaching for something that might only give you a quick buzz but doesn't subside your hunger until dinner time. Sometimes we can actually prevent ourselves from binge eating or overeating at night if we actually consume enough food during the day for our energy requirements and blood sugar levels. As understandably, this is when we are going to be more active, than usual, and our minds are going to be used more frequently. Also, consuming enough water daily is incredibly important for establishing a healthy relationship with food and sustainably eating intuitively. Majority of the population are currently not drinking enough clear water. Hydration requirements for a sedentary person not exercising, and who sits down all day is going to be 2 litres at minimum. So that's where that number comes from. That's the minimum requirement. So a lot of people go, well, I've had my 2 litres, I'm fine. Whereas if you're exercising daily, and you're walking daily, you're doing any sort of cardio, you're moving around, you've got an active role, it can literally be anywhere from 3 to 4 litres and above, even up to 9 litres for some people, especially for those who are incredibly active and perhaps working in laboursome roles, in warmer environments. Drinking water between meals, and sometimes even with your meal, can assist with the digestive process. It's a misconception that drinking water during a meal is going to interrupt that. It's just in larger amounts that would be interruptive of the digestive process. As long as you're not drinking too much water whilst eating, basically. So don't scull water mid-meal. Drinking water can also be the solution between meals when you might feel like you are hungry, when in reality you're actually thirsty. We have the same signal sent to our mouth when we are thirsty as when we are hungry, with that all too familiar dry, pasty feeling in your mouth, yeah? And like, how many times have you had a dry, pasty feeling and you've grabbed something to eat instead of something to drink, like a glass of water? And you might have gone all day and thought to yourself, oh shit, I've only had one glass of water. Maybe I need to stop snacking and have some water. Finally, I'm going to finish up with removing your food guilt around eating certain types of foods, eating out at social events, and feeling anxious about not knowing how many calories might be in a meal or a snack. Oftentimes, when we find ourselves relapsing back into these types of behaviors, it can be incredibly beneficial to focus on the moment in time and how the food is making you feel. It's important to regulate your emotions when you attend social events, and this might include having a discussion with yourself whereby you're looking at and choosing food items and actually considering what you feel like eating. For example, you might not like particular foods on offer, and that's okay. You don't have to put it on your plate. You don't need to eat them just because they are there. I don't particularly like coleslaw, and blue cheese. So when that's presented at a barbecue with friends, I usually just avoid it. I used to, when I had an eating disorder, put things on my plate I didn't even feel like eating because I was thinking I had to eat it because it was there. It's a really strange compulsion. Also understanding that you don't necessarily need to finish everything on your plate. There is no need for you to feel driven to do this. And something that we unfortunately teach our children growing up, that they have to finish everything on their plate. And this is actually, weirdly enough, feeding into disordered eating behaviors as we get older. If you don't feel like eating a food, or you know you've had enough of it, it can be very helpful to start to have this conversation in your mind prior to eating, whilst eating, and even after you've finished your meal. Just to get yourself out of that autopilot mode, which can often see us either over or under eating, and whether we panic or remain calm in a situation surrounding food. Much of this process involves engaging in a thought process surrounding how we actually feel at the time in the moment, and our individual food preferences, separate to other people and separate to what people are asking us to eat and offering us. Something else to remember, if you feel like if you feel like you've eaten too much today, or you've eaten too little, or you've gone a little bit overboard with your intuitive eating and you've maybe gone over your calories, you don't know, just remember, as I said, this is a process that requires plenty of practice, and there are going to be days that you do eat more calories than others, and the next day you might not be as hungry and you may naturally eat less anyway. Try not to overthink it, okay? And try not to approach this way of eating from a place of guilt or shame, because that can then trigger you into then overeating again or undereating again the next day. So this is just a nice, gentle process of really easing your way into it. Give yourself as many opportunities as you need to until you get this right. And you should never compare your food choices to the person next to you, okay? We all have very, very different, vastly different food preferences and fullness cues as well, relationships with food, and your intuitive eating journey is going to be as unique as your individual personality. Don't give up on the process, and of course it's going to be fairly scary and challenging in the beginning, but it does become something that is a second nature behavior eventually. It takes plenty of time to master, but once you do get the hang of it, it can be incredibly rewarding when breaking free from the dieting scene. Even if it's just for a set period of time until you decide you'd like to head towards some major goals again. On that note, I'm going to finish up the podcast. Guys, I really hope that you got some decent tips out of this one today. Happy intuitive eating. If you do have any questions, as always, please do not hesitate to send me a message. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to doing another one for you soon. Bye.